I spent years as Ava Harrison's shadow, quietly cleaning up every mess she made and protecting her from her own mistakes. When she ditched me at the altar to run into another man's arms, I became a national joke, and everyone just assumed I'd be the fool who forgave her again. In reality, every move she made was part of a trap I had set, and her little rebellion for love was just a scene in a script I had already finished writing. I knew exactly how to break her, and the most effective way was to let her dismantle her own life with her own two hands. On my Facebook, it was common knowledge that I had been infatuated with Ava since we were kids. I played the part of the devoted follower perfectly, always being the first to jump whenever she had a whim or a demand. Since she loved the color black, I bought her endless pairs of expensive black silk stockings. When she went through a phase of obsessing over foreign cultures, I tracked down vintage French polka hosiery for her. Even when she took up floral arrangement, I made sure she had the finest floral print leggings to match her new hobby. I put so much effort into catering to her every whim, especially when the designer and I spent months perfecting every single stitch of her wedding gown. The diamonds I carefully selected for her were now hanging messily in her hair as she sat there. Her expression was uncharacteristically soft and tender, clearly whispering sweet nothings to the man on the other end of the line. Anyone who saw that photo would think the man she loved was the luckiest guy in the world. I zoomed in on the image and stared at it for a long time, unable to look away. However, I had already given her a final chance to stay, and she was the one who chose to walk away. I forced myself to harden my heart and commit to my decision, refusing to let even a hint of regret seep in. I splashed cold water on my face, straightened my suit, and carefully fastened every single button. Then, wearing a mask of perfect confidence, I stepped out of the dressing room. Looking at the crowd of confused and whispering relatives, I made a simple announcement that the wedding would proceed exactly as planned. It took 3 days for Ava to finally show her face back in the country. During those 72 hours, I had become the undisputed trending topic across every social media platform. Every news outlet, from the major New York papers to the gossip blogs, was buzzing with the name James Miller. I was the Miller heir who had been humiliated at the altar, but chose to finish the ceremony alone. Some people offer me their pity, while others use the scandal to write think pieces about the cold nature of old money families. Of course, a huge portion of the internet was just enjoying the spectacle and laughing at my expense. Regardless of the rumors, the massive media coverage had thrust me into a level of fame I had never experienced before. Before Ava even had the chance to come crawl back to my family, her father, Mr. Harrison, personally arranged a dinner to offer his formal apologies. The sound of clinking glasses filled the room as the tension slowly began to dissipate. Mr. Harrison stood up, raising his glass high as he looked at me with a mix of respect and regret. He said that this toast was for me because I had proven myself to be a true Miller, every bit as resilient as my father. He thanked me for making the hard choice and keeping my head high, noting that I had saved both our families from total public ruin. He declared that the Harrison family was now in my debt. He promised me right then and there that he would make sure I received the justice I deserved. I raised my glass with practiced humility and was just about to respond to his toast. Suddenly, the heavy doors to the private dining room swung open, and a disheveled, exhausted Ava stumbled inside. The moment my father caught sight of her, his expression turned cold and hostile. My father slammed his glass down onto the table with a deafening crack that echoed through the room. The entire banquet hall went dead silent, and you could have heard a pin drop on the carpet. Mr. Harrison shot my father a tense look before turning his fury toward his daughter, screaming her full name at the top of his lungs. Ava walked slowly toward her father and bowed her head in shame, her voice barely a whisper as she apologized. She admitted she was wrong, but my father only responded with a sharp, derisive snort. He didn't even dignify her presence with a single word of acknowledgement. To everyone's surprise, Ava pulled a thick folder from her bag and slapped it onto the table with renewed confidence. She lifted her chin defiantly and told everyone that she hadn't come back empty-handed. She explained that while she was in Los Angeles, She had used her status as a Miller daughter-in-law to finalize the deal with Apex Dynamics. The partnership with Apex Dynamics was a massive project that our family had been chasing for over 6 months. We had agreed on every minor detail, but the executives at Apex were notorious for dragging their feet on the final signature. My family had exhausted every resource, from high-level lobbying to expensive PR firms, yet we were still stuck in limbo. My father had literally lost sleep over this deal. I had to grudgingly admit that Ava knew exactly how to play her cards. If this contract was legitimate, it would be a monumental victory for the Miller legacy. My father sat there in stunned silence, his anger momentarily eclipsed by the sheer weight of her success. My father was so blindsided by Ava's move that he couldn't find his voice, leaving him to just sit there with a brooding expression. Ava remained standing with her back perfectly straight, appearing remarkably composed despite the earlier chaos. Finally, Mr. Harrison let out a long breath of relief and started clapping, prompting the rest of the room to follow suit. Mr. Harrison looked at my father and asked if he had to admit that his daughter had done a spectacular job by securing the Apex deal. He argued that such a massive contribution should surely earn her some forgiveness. After the initial awkwardness, the rest of the guests joined in the applause, and the heavy tension in the room finally began to lift. I wondered if Ava truly believed that a single signed contract could erase the absolute humiliation she had put my family through. I stood up with a frown and walked over to her, slowly scanning her from head to toe. I wanted her to feel the weight of my scrutiny before I spoke. I asked her why she was still wearing the same dress she had on when she ran away from our wedding. I mockingly wondered if she had been so busy playing nurse to Ethan Reed that she hadn't found a single moment to change her clothes. I even asked if she thought a wedding gown was the appropriate attire for keeping a vigil at another man's bedside. The room plunged back into an icy silence, and the triumphant smile on Ava's face instantly vanished. I forced a polite, hollow smile and draped my arm over her shoulder as if to lead her away from the prying eyes of the guests. I told her she should go get cleaned up and rest, promising her that I would handle the rest of the evening's fallout. Before we could take a step, a thunderous bang shook the table behind me as someone struck it with their fist. I didn't even need to turn around to know it was my father finally losing his temper. His voice boomed through the hall, full of suppressed rage, commanding us both to stay exactly where we were. At that exact moment, a pale and thin man came rushing through the entrance of the banquet hall. He shoved his way between me and Ava, acting like a tragic hero. He immediately started pleading with us not to blame Ava, claiming that everything that had happened was entirely his fault. The intruder was none other than Ethan Reed, the man for whom Ava had abandoned our entire future, her so-called first love. He began bowing and stammering apologies to the guests, but his body looked so frail that he nearly collapsed right there on the floor. Ava didn't hesitate for a second, rushing to his side and gripping his arm to keep him upright. Her face was a mask of pure agony and concern as she asked why he hadn't stayed in the car like she had told him to. She began frantically checking him over, asking if he was in pain or feeling faint. Ethan looked like a ghost, his features twisted in a display of calculated suffering and tragic resignation. He leaned heavily on Ava's shoulder and whispered that she shouldn't ruin her relationship with her father on his account. He coughed weakly, claiming that since his time was short, he didn't want to leave her with more problems to solve. A violent coughing fit interrupted his words, making him look even more pathetic. Ava's expression hardened, and without acknowledging a single person in the room, she began leading him toward the exit as if we didn't exist. She spoke to him in a soothing voice, promising him that she would get him to a hospital immediately. Mr. Harrison's voice cracked like a whip across the silent room, demanding that she stop where she was. He issued a final ultimatum, declaring that if she walked out that door with Ethan, she would be officially disowned and cut off from the Harrison legacy forever. Ava stopped in her tracks and slowly turned to face her father with a look of pure ice in her eyes. She bit her lip and told him that her greatest regret was allowing him to exile Ethan 10 years ago. She made it clear that those days were over and that he no longer held any power over her choices. Mr. Harrison turned a ghastly shade of gray, rendered completely speechless by his daughter's blatant defiance. My father just sat back and shook his head, mockingly telling his old friend that it appeared he had lost all authority over his own household. Ava shot my father a look of pure annoyance and rolled her eyes at his comment. She told him that the only reason she hadn't gone straight to the emergency room was to give him and me the courtesy of an explanation. She suggested that it would be better for everyone if certain truths remained unsaid to avoid unnecessary pain. Then she turned her gaze to me, her eyes cutting through me like a blade. She told me that she had fulfilled her end of the bargain by becoming Mrs. Miller, and I should be satisfied with the title alone. She warned me right then and there to never expect any real affection from her, promising that she would never love me as long as she lived. With that final blow, she turned and helped Ethan out of the room without looking back once. Ethan leaned his weight against her, and just as they reached the exit, he glanced back at me with a faint, mocking smirk that only I was meant to see. While everyone watched, I tightened my grip until the crystal glass shattered in my hand, the shards biting deep into my palm. I felt the warm blood beginning to drip through my fingers and onto the cold marble floor. Ava and I had been inseparable since we were toddlers, and my memories were filled with the kind of childhood sweetness that almost felt like a fairy tale. I had spent my entire life as her shadow, trailing behind her wherever she chose to lead. I conditioned myself to love everything she loved until I lost track of what my own actual interests were. For years, the only hobby James Miller had was making sure Ava Harrison was happy. The Miller and Harrison empires had been woven together for generations through countless mergers and joint ventures. A marriage between our families was seen as the logical conclusion of decades of business strategy. Everyone in our social circle considered our union a done deal, right up until her sophomore year of high school, when everything changed. Ethan Reed showed up at our private academy on a full scholarship, looking every bit the underdog hero. To a girl like Ava, he was like a bright light in a boring, predictable world, someone who seemed exciting and authentic. It didn't take long for her curiosity to turn into a deep, obsessive fascination with him. Before their little romance could truly take flight, Mr. Harrison intervened and crushed it without mercy. Despite Ava's screaming protests and tears, her father used his influence to have Ethan shipped off to an overseas school. From that day on, Ethan Reed vanished from her life, and all lines of communication were severed. She transformed into a cold, distant version of herself, rarely speaking and never truly smiling. Years later, when she finally agreed to the engagement, I asked her what she would do if Ethan ever came back into the picture. Back then, she looked at me with what I thought was genuine affection, her eyes clear and calm. She told me quite seriously that those teenage feelings were buried in the past, and that she had been too young to know what love really was. She insisted that her only desire was to be my wife and to build a life with me. We shared a kiss that felt like a sacred promise that day, but it took almost no time at all for that promise to turn into a lie. I have always prided myself on my self-control, and people rarely ever see me lose my temper. Seeing me snap like I did today probably unsettled the guests more than a physical threat would have. My mother rushed to my side, her hands trembling as she tried to clean the blood and glass from my palm. My father didn't care about social graces anymore and began berating Mr. Harrison in front of everyone before dragging me toward the exit. He was done with the pleasantries, but even in the heat of the moment, I made sure to grab the signed Apex Dynamics contract from the table. Ava didn't reach out to me once, but I didn't need her to because my informants were keeping me updated on her every move with Ethan. Word reached me that Ethan had been diagnosed with terminal cancer and was supposedly living on borrowed time. Despite his supposedly dire condition, he flatly refused to stay in a hospital and insisted on moving into the house I had bought for Ava and me. The most insulting part was that Ava didn't even hesitate before letting him move into our private sanctuary. My brother Lucas was fuming, literally poking me in the chest as he demanded to know if I was just going to take this lying down. He asked me if I even had any pride left, or if I was content being the most famous cuckold in the city. He couldn't believe I was sitting there calmly while another man slept in my bed. His shouting was starting to give me a headache, though a small part of me found his outrage amusing. I paused my work and took a moment to check in with my own emotions, realizing that while I felt a dull ache, it wasn't the world-ending pain he expected. I reached out and patted his shoulder, trying to keep him from having a literal stroke right there in my office. I told him that the first massive payment from Apex Dynamics was due and that I needed to focus on the business because money was far more reliable than women. Lucas actually spat on the floor in disgust, telling me to stop giving him corporate excuses. He reminded me that between the Millers and the Harrisons, we had enough money to buy and sell half the state. He ranted about how our combined families held enough power to shake the entire industry with a single phone call. Seeing him so worked up, I decided to give him a small hint of my actual plan to calm him down. I told him to trust me because this was far from over and Ethan Reed would be coming to see me sooner than he thought. Just as I predicted, Ethan grew frustrated when I didn't react to his provocations and finally reached out to me. He suggested we meet at a small cafe right beneath the Miller corporate headquarters. When I joined him at the table, I took a long, slow look at him before offering a pleasant smile. I told him he looked remarkably healthy for a man with terminal cancer and joked that my wife must be a fantastic nurse. Ethan didn't miss a beat, holding up his hand to show off the antique ring on his finger. It was the Harrison family heirloom, a piece of jewelry that carried immense history and weight. He reminded me that the ring had been given to me on our engagement day and that I had treated it like a sacred relic in a display case. He laughed at the fact that something I considered priceless was now just a toy for him to flaunt. He wanted me to see that he had power over the things I valued most. He told me that my only appeal was my family name and my bank account, and that I had used them to trap Ava in a life she didn't want. He claimed that if you stripped away the Miller wealth, I was a nobody. He boasted that he possessed the one thing I could never buy, which was Ava's genuine heart. Watching him gloat was honestly the highlight of my week because he was so predictable. I congratulated him on finally landing the lead role in his own tragic romance. However, I told him there was one tiny detail he had overlooked that I felt obligated to share with him. I took a slow sip of my coffee before asking him to think back to how he had been unable to reach Ava for an entire decade. I pointed out that it was her father who had ensured he remained a ghost in her life. Then I asked him to consider who exactly had reached out to him with the wedding details right when it would cause the most damage. I asked him how a man who had been blocked for 10 years suddenly found her personal number so easily. Ethan's face went pale as the realization hit him, and he stared at me like I was a monster. He stammered that it couldn't have been me and asked if I had completely lost my mind. I just leaned back and gave him a knowing smile, letting the silence do the talking. He searched my face for any sign of a joke, but his confidence was rapidly being replaced by pure terror. He finally managed to choke out a question, asking me what my endgame really was. I had to bite my tongue to keep from laughing at his sudden fear. I told him that I was simply protecting my interests and my wife, as a man in my position should. I pointed out that after 20 years of investment, I wasn't about to just hand her over without making him work for it. Ethan was shaking with such rage that he looked ready to hurl his coffee at my head. Before he could move, I pulled a legal folder from my bag and slid a specific document across the table. His eyes scanned the header, and the little color he had left drained away as he asked how I had managed to get my hands on it. I gave him one last pleasant smile as I stood up and buttoned my coat. I told him that I wasn't about to let him walk away with a win so easily. I suggested he keep his eyes open because the game was just getting interesting. A few days later, I attended a massive birthday bash in the Hamptons for David Sterling's 20th. I walked into the ballroom just in time to see David land a solid right hook across Ethan Reed's jaw. The sound of the impact was sickeningly clear, and Ethan's face began to bruise almost instantly. David looked absolutely livid as he grabbed Ethan by the collar and slammed him onto the polished floor. He was drawing his foot back for a kick when Ava's panic scream echoed through the room, demanding to know what he was doing. She rushed over, her face pale with shock as she tried to intervene. David stopped and glared at Ava, his eyes burning with a resentment that usually wasn't there. He gestured to his ruined Tom Ford suit, which was missing several buttons and looked like it had been through a shredder. He told her that he had invited her as a friend, but was insulted that she had brought such a lowlife to his private celebration. As the only son of the Sterling dynasty and a literal Hollywood golden boy, David wasn't used to being disrespected. He had won an Oscar at 19 and was arguably the most famous face in the country at the moment. He had grown up with the world at his feet, so having a nobody like Ethan start a fight was a new experience for him. David had never been humiliated like this in his entire life, especially not at his own party. Before Ava could even try to de-escalate, Ethan scrambled to his feet and shoved David with all his might, screaming at him to stay away from his woman. He accused David of being a predator who was trying to get Ava drunk, claiming he knew exactly what David's real intentions were. David looked at him with pure disbelief, pointing out that he was the host and had been toasting every single guest in the room. Ethan completely ignored him, turning to Ava with the most pathetic, tearful expression he could muster. He apologized to her, saying he felt like a failure for not being able to protect her from the cruel world of the elite. He lamented his lack of a famous name or the wealth of someone like David Sterling, saying he deserved to be treated like trash. Ava looked like her heart was physically breaking as she threw her arms around him, ignoring the dozens of guests staring at them. She called him a fool and promised him that he would always be her only true sanctuary. Ethan looked into her eyes and whispered that he wished he could give her the life she deserved, with awards and luxury villas just like David's. Ava didn't even hesitate, pulling out her phone right there in the middle of the party to call her talent scouts. She ordered them to put all their resources into making Ethan Reed the next big thing in Hollywood. I watched the entire spectacle from across the room, barely able to contain my amusement at how pathetic they both were. It was fascinating to see how people never truly outgrow the insecurities of their youth. Ava, once the untouchable princess of the East Coast, was being systematically dismantled by a man who was clearly using her for everything she was worth. It didn't take long for Ava to become the primary target of every gossip column and socialite group in New York. As her husband, I was naturally part of the joke, though I played the role of the oblivious victim perfectly. Ethan had become her permanent shadow, hovering over her at every charity gala and private dinner she attended. Ethan's frequent public outbursts and jealous fits eventually drove every other man in our social circle away from her. I didn't cross paths with Ava again until our families were required to attend a high-profile signing ceremony with the mayor's office. It was a multi-billion-dollar infrastructure project that demanded a unified front from the Miller and Harrison families. The city had organized a major press conference, and our joint presence was non-negotiable for the sake of the investors. Our fathers had both begun to transition into semi-retirement, leaving the day-to-day operations of the conglomerate to Ava and me. This meant we were the new faces of the partnership, and we were expected to appear as a devoted, powerhouse couple. While we were waiting in the green room before the event, I was surprised to see that Ava was actually unaccompanied for once. I casually remarked on Ethan's absence, asking if he was taking the day off from being her shadow. She shot me a look that was filled with a fleeting, dark flicker of something that looked like regret. She bit her lip and told me that Ethan was busy on a film set across town. It had been months since she told me she would never love me, yet she suddenly flashed me a smile that looked almost real. She told me quite seriously that she knew how much this project meant and that appearing with her husband was the right thing to do. I immediately took a couple of steps back to maintain a professional distance between us. I told her that in a professional setting like this, it would be much more appropriate if she addressed me as Mr. Miller. Her smile faltered, and she tried to step closer to me, whispering my name in a tone that sounded almost desperate. The moderator began announcing the guest list, signaling that it was time for us to take our places on the stage. I refused to acknowledge whatever emotion she was trying to project and simply gave her a cold nod before walking out into the lights. I was well aware that every major news network was currently broadcasting our every move live to the nation. Once we were seated, I leaned in slightly toward her and asked if Ethan was aware that we were spending the afternoon together. The acoustics of the hall were poor, so Ava had to lean in quite close to hear my whisper over the moderator's introduction. To any observer watching the live stream, it looked like an intimate moment between a loving couple. Almost as if on cue, her phone began to buzz incessantly on the table between us. The mayor took the podium to begin his opening remarks, and I saw Ava look down at the caller ID with a look of pure annoyance. She hesitated for only a second before silencing the phone and turning it face down on the table. The mayor's speech went on for several minutes, and her phone never stopped vibrating for a single second of it. I caught a glimpse of the name Ethan flashing on the screen and turned to her with a mockingly pleasant smile. I whispered that I was truly envious of a relationship that required such constant, obsessive attention. Ava kept her mouth shut and refused to take the bait as she stared straight ahead. When it was finally time for the corporate representatives to speak, the camera zoomed in on me for my keynote. As I stood up, I made sure to stumble slightly as if my leg had fallen asleep, leaning my weight toward Ava. Ava reacted exactly as I expected, jumping up to steady me and wrapping her arm firmly around mine to keep me from falling. I looked down at her and gave her a polite, distant thank you, addressing her by her maiden name. She seemed dazed by the interaction, staring up at me for several seconds before she realized she was still holding on to me. I was just about to begin my speech when a frantic staffer ran onto the stage and whispered something to the moderator. After a hurried conversation with the officials, the main projector screen flickered and switched to a shaky, live video feed. The entire room gasped as the image of Ethan Reed appeared, standing precariously on the edge of a skyscraper rooftop. He was screaming into his phone, demanding to know why Ava was ignoring him and why she was with me again. He raved about how happy I looked and accused her of betraying him with every smile she gave me. He cried out that she was forcing him to take these extreme measures just to get a moment of her time. Ava stood up in the middle of the press conference, her eyes glued to the screen as she pleaded with him to be rational and come down. She told him that the event was just business and that she had no choice but to attend. Ethan screamed back that he didn't believe her, arguing that a woman with her wealth and power was never forced to do anything she didn't want to do. He accused her of secretly wanting to be with me, pointing out that since we were legally married, we must be spending all our time together. He worked himself into a frenzy, screaming about how he saw her hold my hand on the live feed. He ended his rant by calling her a shameless liar in front of the entire city. I was busy coordinating the emergency response for some people injured in a minor accident nearby, making sure everyone was taken care of. Suddenly, Ava's phone erupted with Ethan's voice on speakerphone, sounding absolutely hysterical. He was sobbing about a car crash, claiming he was trapped and bleeding out, begging her to come save him. I looked over and saw Ava dropping a bandage she was holding as she scrambled to her feet in a panic. She didn't even think before shouting that she was coming for him and demanding to know his location. She was already halfway to the door before anyone could even react to the news. I let out a heavy sigh and called out to her, reminding her that she couldn't just abandon the scene of a major corporate crisis. I pointed out that the company involved was a Harrison subsidiary and that any mishandling of the situation would ruin her family standing. I told her that as the executive in charge, it was her legal and moral duty to stay and handle the aftermath. Hearing my voice in the background seemed to trigger Ethan into an even more dramatic performance of suffering. He began crying about how he might die alone and told Ava to forget he ever existed if this was the end. Ava stopped in her tracks, her face contorted with the agonizing choice between her family's empire and her first love. Finally, she grabbed my sleeve with shaking hands and begged me to handle the crisis for her. She sobbed that Ethan was dying and that she couldn't let him spend his final moments alone. She promised to make it up to me somehow before turning and running out the door without waiting for my consent. I watched her leave with a cold smile and asked her if she remembered the nickname people used to have for me back in school. I told her they used to call me Autumn, but she didn't even turn around to ask why. She just kept running, leaving me alone in the wreckage of the day while I whispered the answer to myself. When autumn arrives, it means the crops have finished growing and it is finally time to reap what has been sown. The accident was a total PR disaster, but the real killing blow was the viral video of Ava fleeing the scene of the tragedy. Someone had captured the entire moment on their phone and uploaded it to TikTok, where it was spreading like wildfire. The Harrison family's reputation, which was already hanging by a thread, was now effectively destroyed in the eyes of the public. I spent the next 48 hours without a wink of sleep, acting as the sole voice of reason for both families. I stepped up as the devoted husband and the crisis manager, doing everything in my power to contain the fire she had started. I personally met with the families of the victims, drafted massive compensation packages, and micromanaged every single PR statement. By the time the dust finally settled, I was running on nothing but caffeine and spite. As I walked out of the Harrison corporate headquarters, I was surprised to see Ava waiting for me by the entrance. She looked like a ghost of her former self, her eyes red from crying and her expensive clothes wrinkled and stained. She tried to call my name, but her voice was so ravaged by sobbing that it was barely a rasp. She told me through her tears that Ethan had been arrested and that her father had suffered a massive heart attack and was currently fighting for his life in intensive care. I didn't even acknowledge her pathetic state and instead looked up at the horizon where the sun was just beginning to rise. The darkness of the night was finally being pushed back by the first rays of dawn. I turned to her with a pleasant, hollow smile and told her to look up because a brand new day was finally starting. We rushed to the hospital the moment we heard that Mr. Harrison was stable and conscious. He looked 10 years older than he had a few days ago, his hair having gone almost entirely white from the stress. The second he saw Ava enter the room, he closed his eyes in shame and turned his face toward the wall. Mrs. Harrison was a total wreck, her eyes so swollen from crying that she could barely see. She grabbed my hands and started sobbing again, thanking me for everything I had done to save the family business. Ava was about to try and apologize when her phone started ringing, and she hesitantly answered it on speakerphone. A cold, professional voice on the other end identified themselves as being from the local precinct where Ethan was being held. They informed her that Ethan had been demanding to see her and had attempted to harm himself when his request was denied. They assured her he was fine, having only sustained minor injuries, but they needed her to come down to the station. Ava didn't even wait for the officer to finish speaking before she was sprinting toward the hospital room door. Her mother let out a guttural, heartbroken scream, begging her daughter to stay and choose her family for once. Ava hesitated for a fraction of a second at the threshold, but ultimately chose Ethan, disappearing into the hallway without a single backward glance. A single tear rolled down Mr. Harrison's cheek as he lay there in silence, the weight of his daughter's betrayal finally breaking him. The air in the room felt heavy and suffocating as I stood by his bedside, unsure of what to say. Just as I was about to leave them to their grief, his assistant Charlie came bursting into the room, gasping for air. Charlie looked like he was about to deliver a death sentence as he stammered that something terrible had happened. I caught him by the shoulders and told him to take a breath and tell us exactly what was going on. He looked at the frail man in the hospital bed and hesitated, clearly terrified that the news would cause another heart attack. Mr. Harrison gave a weak wave of his hand, signaling for Charlie to speak regardless of the consequences. Charlie explained that the mayor's office had just sent over a formal notice regarding the viral video and the accident. They were so disgusted by Ava's lack of ethics that they were demanding the Harrison family withdraw from the multi-billion-dollar project entirely. When the board's decision to officially strip Ava of her title as general manager was announced, her mother nearly collapsed in a state of pure panic. The machines hooked up to Mr. Harrison began to wail as his heart rate spiked and his breathing became shallow and ragged. I could see the literal moment his will to fight finally evaporated. I slammed my hand onto the emergency call button as the monitor's alarms grew louder and more frantic. Before the medical team could even make it through the door, the older man's eyes rolled back in his head and he went limp. The doctors later confirmed that he had suffered a massive, debilitating stroke. He survived the ordeal, but the stroke had left him paralyzed on his left side, meaning he would likely spend the rest of his life in a specialized care facility. By the time Ava finally bothered to show up at the hospital, the board had already held an emergency meeting and voted. She was greeted with the news that she had been officially replaced as CEO, and I was the one taking over her family's empire. Ava spent nearly a week camping out in the hospital hallway, but her mother refused to let her even step foot inside the room. Late one night, I was exhausted from the transition of power and decided to just crash on the sofa in my new office. I had just dimmed the lights when my phone began to buzz incessantly on the desk, displaying Ava's name. I stared at the screen for a long time before finally deciding to answer, though I didn't say a word at first. When I finally spoke her name, there was a long, heavy silence from the other end of the line. When she eventually responded, her voice was so thick and raspy from crying that I could barely recognize her. In the quiet of the empty office, she sobbed my name and told me that she had returned the Harrison heirloom ring to its proper place. She sounded broken as she asked why I hadn't come to collect it after all this time. She seemed to think that the ring was the only thing still connecting us. I let the silence stretch out, carefully choosing my words to make sure they cut as deep as possible. I reminded her that my entire life, I had made it a rule never to touch anything that belonged to someone else. She let out a dry, bitter laugh that sounded more like a sob, asking if I now considered her to be just another used item that belonged to Ethan. I didn't bother to deny it, and simply gave her a cold affirmation before falling silent again. The late-night shadows seemed to grow longer as she finally began to unravel, her speech a chaotic mix of hysterical laughter and jagged sobbing. She had clearly reached her breaking point and was finally ready to tell the truth. She revealed that Ethan had been lying to her about the terminal cancer the entire time to manipulate her into staying with him. She finally realized why he had been so adamant about avoiding doctors and staying hidden in our house. The mandatory medical exam at the police station had exposed his entire charade, proving he was as healthy as a horse. Her voice rose to a hysterical pitch as she confessed her absolute regret for throwing away her life for a con artist. She realized she had spent a decade hating her father for a man who didn't deserve a second of her time. She wept about missing our wedding and shattering my heart, finally claiming that I was the only person who had ever truly loved her. I sat in the darkness and listened to her break down without offering a single word of comfort. As a cool breeze drifted through the office window, my mind drifted back to the nights right after Ethan was first sent away. Ava had spent months using me as a punching bag for her resentment, getting blackout drunk and screaming at me for her father's decisions. I had been so pathetic back then, following her to every dive bar in the city just to make sure she made it home safe. I remembered one specific night when the air was just as crisp as it was tonight. I was standing outside a VIP lounge waiting for her when I overheard her friends talking about our relationship. They were telling her that my devotion was becoming embarrassing and that she should just tell me to get lost if she wasn't interested. They suggested that she was being cruel by keeping me on a leash while she mourned another man. I stood there in the hallway, listening to them laugh at my expense. Ava's response had been cold enough to freeze my blood, claiming that Ethan was only suffering because of our impending union. She questioned why I deserve a life of luxury, while Ethan was in exile, and she swore she would marry me just to destroy the Miller legacy from the inside. She wanted to make me the most humiliated man on the planet as revenge for her broken heart. When I finally snapped back to reality, the line was silent except for the sound of Ava's heavy, rhythmic breathing as she cried herself to sleep. I whispered into the receiver, telling her that the James she knew was long gone. I told her that I had moved on from our twisted game years ago, and then I finally hung up. It was a beautiful, sunny afternoon when David Sterling and I decided to pay Ethan Reed a visit at the county jail. The stress of his arrest and the exposure of his lies had turned him into a shell of a man, looking frail and hollowed out. We sat on the other side of the reinforced glass, watching him tremble as he picked up the intercom. He stared at me with pure hatred, finally putting the pieces together and asking if I was the one who had lured him back. He screamed that I was a psychopath for orchestrating the destruction of my own wedding just to ruin him. He couldn't wrap his head around why I would do this to the woman I supposedly loved. He turned his fury toward David, blaming him for goading him into his failed attempt at fame. He screamed that if he hadn't tried to become an actor, he never would have been in the public eye or ended up in jail for the accident. He wailed that my plan had stripped him of his leverage over Ava and exposed every single one of his lies. He sobbed about how we had destroyed his perfect life, but I just looked at him with pity. I asked him why he still thought this was about a woman when it was clearly about an empire. I made it clear that Ava was never the prize. The total acquisition of the Harrison family assets was the only goal I ever had. The guards had to force him back into his seat as he screamed about being a pawn in our elite games. I stood up and looked down at him through the glass, reminding him of his own arrogance when he moved into my home. I asked him where this moral outrage was when he was stealing my family ring and flaunting in my face. I told him that if he hated the games of the rich so much, he never should have tried to play them. He lunged at the glass, screaming that he would tell Ava the truth about my manipulation. I didn't even blink as I took a few steps back, gave him a final wave, and hung up the intercom before walking out. On the drive back to the city, David asked how I had been so certain they would fall for my traps. I explained that everyone is a slave to their own deepest desires and insecurities. Ava had lived a life of total privilege, and because Ethan was the only thing she was ever denied, he became the anchor that would eventually drown her. Ethan was even easier to predict because he had spent a decade obsessing over the lifestyle he thought Ava could provide. All I had to do was open the door a crack, and he rushed in like a starving man to a feast. His own greed ensured that he would pull Ava down into the gutter with him. With the endorsement of both our fathers, I officially took control of the new corporate entity. The merger of our two empires was a complex surgical operation where a single mistake could have cost billions. After months of intense board meetings and legal maneuvering, the shareholders finally approved the historic merger of the Harrison and Miller conglomerates. The two rival dynasties were finally united into a single, unstoppable force under my absolute command. Under my leadership, our stock prices hit record highs and our market dominance was absolute. Meanwhile, Ava had become a ghost in her own life, stripped of her title and her purpose. She spent her days in the house I bought, playing the part of a dutiful wife and constantly texting me about dinner plans. I never once set foot in that house, ignoring her messages as if she were a total stranger. Our lives continued in this cold, empty pattern until the day Ethan Reed was finally released from prison. Ava burst into my office with a frantic Ethan trailing behind her, her eyes wild and bloodshot. She was shaking so violently she could barely stand, reaching out toward me as if I were a lifeline she was afraid to touch. She begged me to tell her that the things Ethan had just told her were all lies. Ethan stood there with a smug, self-satisfied grin, finally revealing my role in their downfall. I looked at Ava's desperate face and gave a slow, deliberate nod, confirming that his story was mostly accurate. Ava recoiled as if I had struck her, violently slapping Ethan's hand away when he tried to comfort her. She looked at me with a hollow, devastated expression, asking if our entire shared history had been a lie. She questioned if my years of devotion and every time I had protected her were just part of an elaborate performance. She couldn't understand how the man who had catered to her every whim could be the one who destroyed her. She cried out, asking if the joy I showed on our engagement day was just another layer of the deception. She told me she truly believed I was the only person in the world who had her back. I just sat there in silence, letting her questions hang in the air without giving her the satisfaction of an answer. I reached into my desk drawer and pulled out a final set of documents, sliding them across the mahogany surface toward her. I told her that those papers would provide all the clarity she needed regarding our relationship. Her hands shook as she turned the pages, and I watched the color drain from her face as she read the truth. I gestured for Ethan to lead her to the leather sofa while I poured her a cup of black coffee. I told her it was time for us to be completely honest with each other about our motivations. I reminded her of how desperately my family had needed the Apex Dynamics deal and how we had been met with a brick wall for months. I revealed that I knew the CEO of Apex was an old college friend of hers from her days in Los Angeles. I explained how I discovered that she had used her family's influence to sabotage our negotiations behind the scenes. It was clear that her entire goal from the beginning had been to bankrupt my family as a form of revenge. I looked at Ethan's confused face and mockingly thanked him for his role in my acquisition. I pointed out to Ava that her obsession with his fake illness was the only reason she had finally surrendered the Apex contract to my father. She had been so desperate to run to her first love that she handed over the keys to her family's kingdom just to buy her freedom. I told her I understood that Ethan was the love of her life, but pointed out that her father was the one who actually tore them apart. I reminded her that I had been the one who always stood by her, yet she chose to make me the target of her misplaced rage. She had decided to punish me and my family for her father's sins, and I simply decided to strike back. I asked her why she ever agreed to the marriage if she hated me so much, though we both knew it was because she needed the Miller reputation to protect her own interests. I told her that in a twisted way, I had given her exactly what she wanted by merging our families into one powerhouse. Since she was still legally my wife, she was technically more powerful than ever, even if she had no actual control over anything. Ava stared at me with bloodshot eyes and asked why I had bothered to marry her if I knew she was sabotaging me the whole time. I looked at her with total indifference, telling her that our marriage was the legal anchor I needed to finalize the merger. Our wedding wasn't a celebration of love. It was the final signature on a hostile takeover. The silence in the office was deafening as she sat there processing the total destruction of her life. She eventually stood up and walked toward the exit with a hollow, robotic gait. Just as she reached the door, she looked back one last time and vowed that she would find a way to take back everything I had stolen from her. Ava spent the next 2 years trying every legal and social maneuver to regain her standing, but she was blocked at every turn. The merger was ironclad, and the only thing she truly owned was a tiny percentage of non-voting stock that paid out a meager dividend. She had become a complete outsider in the world her family had helped build. The constant stream of rejections eventually broke her spirit, and she retreated into a life of shallow hedonism. She became the very thing she used to mock, spending her nights at exclusive clubs and mindless parties to numb the pain. For my 25th birthday, Lucas and David threw a massive party and invited every young heir and socialite in the city to celebrate my success. I was lounging on a velvet sofa, half listening to the loud music and the drunken conversations of my friends. Lucas decided I wasn't having enough fun and paraded a line of stunning models in front of me, telling me to pick one for the night. He leaned in with a mischievous grin, suggesting that I could even take 2 or 3 if I felt like it. I glanced over the group with a bored expression before casually pointing at a girl who stood at the end of the line. She knelt down beside my chair and whispered my name with a shy, practiced modesty that I found mildly entertaining. She had that perfect mix of a sweet face and a dangerous silhouette that made her a favorite in these circles. She began gently massaging my shoulders, her soft voice acting as a pleasant distraction from the chaos of the party. I was almost drifting off when a sharp, familiar voice cut through the music and the laughter. Ava was standing over us, her voice dripping with a mix of jealousy and desperation as she reminded me that she was still my wife. The poor girl beside me flinched at the intrusion, her hands freezing in fear of the famous Mrs. Miller. I patted her hand to reassure her and told her to keep going before looking up at Ava's furious expression. I laughed and told her that she should be happy because I had fulfilled my promise to make her my wife, just as she had always intended. I warned her to stop looking for love or affection in a marriage that was built on a foundation of mutual sabotage. My friends erupted in laughter at my coldness, and I leaned back, closing my eyes once again. For a moment, I saw the ghost of the boy I used to be, the one who spent his life chasing her, and I felt a sense of peace knowing that he had finally stopped running. One-sided effort will never lead to a mutual connection where both people are moving toward one another. It is not your fault that your feelings were unrequited. However, staying stuck in the past is merely an act of cruelty toward yourself. Ultimately, James Miller was not waiting for Ava Smith to return. He was waiting for the version of himself that could finally stop waiting altogether. You deserve to find that same peace for yourself.